the following. All right. So in this part of the competition, you're taking on a fictional business identity and assigning a fictional identity to the judges, which I think you've already discussed with Gail, but you'll tell us as well. Please make sure everybody knows who you are, and please let us know who we are, so that we don't have role confusion as well. The presentation is 25 minutes. There's a 5-minute cushion after the buzzer sounds to complete, to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem and to recommend a solution that passes muster on the legal, financial, and ethical grounds. That will be uninterrupted, and you know me, I like to interrupt, so I have to refrain from doing that for half an hour. After that, we're going to ask you questions. You'll be in the hot seat for 20 minutes. I'll start, and then I'll turn it over to the other judges. During Q&A, we all stay in the character that you've assigned to us as well as to yourselves. A couple of things, and then afterwards we'll step out of character and give you feedback. A couple of important things. The ethical analysis is the most important because this is a business ethics competition and not a legal ethics or a finance competition. The ethical elements need to be described in simple, practical, common sense fashion, not in ethical ease. So using technical philosophical terminology or basing your argument on religious or theological grounds is a serious weakness. Similarly, reading your notes or reading from the PowerPoint is a serious mistake. And then tomorrow you will have the 10-minute and the 90-second presentation as well. So we're first going to go down the line here and we're going to tell you our backgrounds. My name is Ruth Kraft. I retired from the New York State court system as the supervising judge for labor and employment, and my specialty involves classification and employee versus independent contractor status. And before that, I was a law professor at New York University, and I now chair the employment law group doing management side only of a firm in New York that has 7 offices. Gail, what's up?
I'm Gail O'Brien. I had a corporate background that included Mitsubishi Motors being recruited after the sexual harassment lawsuit to change the culture in Pricewaterhouse. I am the ethics coach columnist for Entrepreneur Magazine. I do a lot of leadership columnist writing, and I'm an executive coach.
I'm Michael Reiner. I have been involved with the event since 1996, mainly on the operations side, and just helped Tom out along the way. So in my full-time job, I lead a small web development team for a small agency in Pennsylvania.
And he's an ethicist by implication and by experience,
Yes.
if not by training. Okay, so we're going to start, and I'm going to hit the start button, and it worked. So you can take this. Oh, I'm sorry, I started it, but for the wrong amount of time. So where'd you get this to stop? Okay, here we go. Here you go. It is running.
Okay. So we're rolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So just as a brief introduction, I would just introduce the team basically. We are representing some executives internally within Uber, and you are taking the role of Uber's principal shareholders. And we are presenting our challenge, which is to integrate autonomous vehicle technology into Uber's business development plan while indiscriminately prioritizing the needs of the environment, Uber's users, as well as our employees. And I'll now turn it over to Katie for ethical analysis. That's the arrow to the right.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Stevens, and I am the Acting Ethics Compliance Officer for Uber. And I'm here today to talk to you, our shareholders, about our proposal to transition Uber to the autonomous car model. But before I talk about our future, I just kind of want to position our proposal against the backdrop of Uber's past and rising success. So when we proposed this model in 2010, it was so simple. We just provided a platform that connected riders in areas that needed rides with those who could provide them using a resource that they already had, which was their private car. And it has just been a global phenomenon. People have been responding very positively, and it has essentially revolutionized the way that we get around. So we currently operate in over 600 countries, or 60 countries and 404 cities all over the world, and we're valued at around $68.8 billion. So these numbers and the global success that we've enjoyed in the past couple of years, we think that it points to an obvious fact, and that is that people, our customers, really value the convenience that our model offers. And so the autonomous model that we're proposing to you today is only going to increase customer satisfaction and convenience, as well as has some serious ethical, is ethically significant in that it will increase customer safety, as well as have really positive environmental benefits. So we'll be talking about this from a couple different standpoints. I'm going to talk about one ethical dimension of the proposal, and Taylor Adnan is going to talk about some of the legal hurdles that we face in transitioning to autonomy, and Mr. Rhodes is going to be talking about the financial aspects of this. Okay? So in moving to the autonomous model, Uber would take out the human driver element of our model that we currently have. So people would be picked up and dropped off by self-driving cars. So currently, GM, Tesla, Nissan, Mercedes, as well as Ford, like most car manufacturers, most major car manufacturers are all in the development process or have developed autonomous models. And it's projected that by 2025, they're going to be commonplace. So as you can see, there's a real push from the industry that we're operating in to like adopt this model in order to be sustainable in the long term. Okay. So currently, we're still considering whether or not we're going to actually develop the infrastructure to produce the cars themselves, ourselves, or if we're going to buy them from an external producer. But we have good reason to favor buying them from an external manufacturer, and we are actually considering Tesla as the, like our highest competitor to adopt their autonomous model right now, which Mr. Rhodes is going to talk about later in the financial analysis. Right. Sorry. Okay. So here are some projections of what Uber is going to look like at this stage. So Columbia University conducted a study, and they found that in New York City, if Uber released a fleet of 9,000 autonomous cars, they could completely replace the taxi industry that is currently operating there. And in this model, the wait time for a car would only be 36 seconds at a rate of about 50 cents per mile. So this speaks to the convenience that our customers would enjoy under this model, as well as the low cost. And we project that this would reduce private ownership of cars substantially because it's going to be so cheap to get around cities. So again, it's going to be a little bit cheaper to get around cities, and a Morgan Stanley study found that cars are only utilized about 4% of the time, but they cost up to $9,000 a year to uphold. So it's becoming increasingly inefficient to own a car in a big city, especially if you live and drive. If you live in a city and drive less than 10,000 miles a year, it's actually more financially beneficial to utilize UberX at this point. Okay, so just gonna go through a couple of the positive benefits that this model is going to have. So increased safety is one of our main selling points, basically, on the autonomous model. So as of now, instances of human error account for 90% of car accidents. So if accidents were reduced by 90%, it would save 30,000 lives and prevent 2.12 billion injuries annually. Another component in the safety conversation is that riders would no longer be placed in a car with a person that they don't know. And although this hasn't been a major concern for Uber as of now, it's sort of a looming concern that it's gotten some attention in the news, and there have been some instances of sexual assault and foul play on the part of our drivers. And so this model would take out that human component and be safer in terms of less accidents, as well as being prone to risky situations. Okay, so the autonomous model would also increase mobility for the elderly and disabled, improves traffic circulation. So it would reduce freeway congestion significantly, And traffic, as we know, is one of the big producers of of smog and other environmental harms. So this is what is going to be our focus though today. So the environmental benefits of adopting the autonomous model are huge. So mostly the reduced emissions that this offers. So a self-driving electric taxi would provide 90% lower greenhouse gas emissions than a gasoline-powered privately owned vehicle. And so this is huge because this actually has the potential to reverse the devastating effects of global climate change. And this seems like something that we need to start doing immediately before it becomes irreversible. And it could also significantly reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Okay. So, given that we work in the transportation industry, Uber is acutely aware of the devastating effects that the overuse and overproduction of cars have on our environment. And so, because we're a pretty big player in this conversation, we think that it's our responsibility to mitigate those negative environmental effects, especially because we now have the technology that allows us to be able to do that. Okay. So I'm going to address one ethical concern. We're all going to talk about some ethical dimensions in our respective parts. But what we see as the sort of chief ethical concern in adopting the autonomous model is that it's going to displace all of our current drivers. And it's not something that is only going to affect our drivers, but it has implications for the mass unemployment in other sectors that are associated with the transportation industry, like the auto manufacturers themselves, service industry, parking, insurance. So this is going to have a significant human impact. If we're going to take away the livelihood of our employees, we have an understanding that that is going to adversely affect their way and quality of life, and our responsibility, we think that we have a responsibility to try and mitigate those harms as much as we can, but, sorry, okay. So the ability for our drivers to earn a decent living has been something that we have really been proud of throughout the projection of Uber. When we face backlash from the taxi industry for not offering benefits or sort of flooding the transportation market, we had that backing that we're providing this flexible employment for people who wouldn't otherwise have it. And so what we're proposing now seems to go against that original justification that we offered. But we think that the environmental concerns and the benefits that will come from adopting this model are too great to ignore. And because Uber is in a place that they have the technology, we see it in the development of autonomous cars throughout the car manufacturing world. And we're in a place where we have a huge customer base. So what we implement will have a very wide reach. And we have the resources to implement it in a meaningful and significant way. So we think that places this responsibility on us to make the most ethically sound decision, not just for the short term, because we see that the short-term harms are going to be had by the loss of jobs and the potential societal problems that are going to come with that. But we're thinking more of our responsibility in the long term, and we're trying to mitigate the more devastating harms that irreversible global climate change will have if we keep engaging in non-environmentally sound practices. So again, we're in this position where we can do it. We have the technology to do so. We have the customer base to do so, the resources. So we think that it is the most ethical choice to think about the long-term effects and trying to mitigate the more devastating harms that will come in the future. And Taylor's going to give us a legal analysis of the plausibility of this model.
Hi, once again, I'm Taylor Adnan and the head legal counsel. I want to start off the conversation on the legal ramifications of autonomous vehicles for Uber with a brief history and background on the laws that are already on the books. There aren't a lot of laws that pertain to autonomous cars now because it's relatively new technology and hasn't emerged into the marketplace yet. But nonetheless, there are a few laws we can look at as case studies and that we'll have to navigate around as we produce and try to implement these cars. First of all, in 1968, the United Nations passed a convention on road traffic, which stated that people had to be the main drivers and not computers. And then that could pose an issue for driverless cars everywhere, but because it's the United Nations Convention, it isn't legally binding on US soil. And in 2016, the United States kind of loosened this law by allowing Google to test their cars by claiming that Google's AI counted as a driver and thus didn't violate the UN Convention. Then in 2011, another law was passed that governs whether or not driverless cars can be used in Nevada. And it was passed because they felt that it would increase revenue streams there, and they wanted to be a player in this market as it emerged. Finally, a law in California that's being proposed but hasn't been passed and has started with DMV regulations honestly detracts from our model. It states that drivers have to purchase these cars, and to do so, they have to go through extensive training practices. The cars have to go through testing by a third party, and the cars have to be certified by DMV, which costs $35,000 to $55,000. But there has been some backlash to these recommendations, and they haven't been approved yet. In fact, within the coming year, there's supposed to be talks on it in the legislature. And so, although that's scary for us as a company, we're not incredibly worried about it because we do have allies in the legislature and in the government that we can lobby through K Street. For example, Anthony Fox, who's Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation, stated that he didn't want, and his institution, his regulatory apparatus, didn't want to fight against autonomous vehicles and instead wanted to be part of the solution to implementing them into the marketplace. So that kind of takes me to my next point, like what do we need to effectively implement autonomous cars into the marketplace? And the first and most important thing is infrastructure. As our public policy is currently constituted, the infrastructure for driverless cars is sufficient, but not the best it can possibly be. That's because public policy in transportation and pertaining to automobiles relies on people's sense of sight effectively. Like you see a green, red, or yellow light, or you see like an octagon that's red, you know what that means. But for driverless cars, they do most of their calculation based on velocity and the size of the object in its path or around it to determine what to do. And although it can do so, that technology is rather cumbersome compared to what we could potentially do using radio waves to signal the car stopping and that kind of thing. And so this takes this question, like how would we do this? Obviously changing this infrastructure would be incredibly expensive, and why would the United States bother? How could we lobby them to do so? And the answer is driverless cars are safer than cars driven by people. 93% of accidents are caused by human error. And so taking humans out of the equation and allowing computers to do the driving protects us effectively. Computers don't have to do the makeup in the car where they drive. They don't text and drive. They don't fall asleep at the wheel. And because of that, that can save over 30,000 lives in the US alone. So that takes me kind of to my next part of my topic, which is what is the United States federal government and states' role in safety? There's a few questions that come up, both ethical and legal, about whether or not autonomous cars are safe and what to do with the programming. For example, should the car drive itself off a cliff to avoid hitting a pedestrian, or should it hit the pedestrian and protect the driver? And although that's a potential problem for Uber as well as any other car manufacturers that are trying to produce autonomous vehicles, it's not something we have to tackle alone. Because just as seatbelts and airbags were institutionalized and regulated by the federal government, which created an industry standard, the same will happen with that programming. Furthermore, the federal government should institute, and most likely will institute, manufacturing regulation on the cars as well as the programming in the near future. All right. So the final and perhaps the hardest legal challenge for autonomous vehicles is what to do about liability. Even though these cars haven't gotten into an accident that it was responsible for in all of the testing in Texas, California, and Nevada, they inevitably will eventually fail and an accident will occur. So what happens when an autonomous vehicle hits someone or gets in a car crash that results in a lot of property damage or, God forbid, someone dying? I propose, well, first of all, there's no case law to address that issue because it hasn't happened yet. So it's an open topic. And these kind of accidents involving autonomous cars could result in a design defect lawsuit, which are much more expensive than lawsuits that pertain to negligence or, sorry, I got the legal term, or ordinary negligence laws. Yeah. And so our proposal is the autonomous vehicles should be treated as the drivers are treated now in the system. And they shouldn't be subject to these default laws, and instead should fall under ordinary negligence laws. This would be beneficial to us because the average cost of ordinary negligence lawsuit involving an auto vehicle is $16,500, while a design defect lawsuit cost is over 15 times that amount. So this would save us money, and it has legal precedence from tort law, as stated in this textbook. A bad state of mind is neither necessary nor sufficient to show negligent conduct is everything. So what that effectively means is we won't be looking at the programming of the car itself, we'd be looking at like what actually occurs. And this is really important for us to establish that ordinary negligence is the law we want to be put under because of the potential for recalls that could occur and how expensive those would be for us to deal with. And yeah, thank you very much. Now Tyler will introduce the financial aspect.
Thank you. So as a team, we've structured our analysis around the objective of trying to create a pragmatic solution to the integration of autonomy that not only addresses an ethical framework, but also achieves the primary objective of the business, which is, of course, to garner profit and grow. So in that regard, Uber has a problem. They do not currently possess any manufacturing capabilities in order to produce autonomous vehicles. They, as Katie mentioned earlier, are faced with the choice of purchasing vehicles, which is expensive, or producing it themselves. But how would we do this since we have a trendy office in San Francisco? Tesla is the solution. With Uber's significant cash on hand, we are proposing a structured acquisition of the Fremont, California-based company Tesla, which has experienced slow but steady growth in the last decade. However, they would benefit greatly from an injection of cash from a rising star, rather titan, like Uber. According to the International Business Times, Tesla's market cap value is currently hovering around $30 to $32 billion. And Uber is expected to grow from $62 to $68.8 billion just this year, arming them with sufficient cash for this acquisition, which today would cost approximately $21 billion. But we estimate that this acquisition would actually occur in 2020 to the tune of $24 billion. Still highly feasible. Uber is a macroeconomic company with a global user base, and Tesla is a manufacturing company. And they essentially solve each other's problem because Tesla has failed to breach into a mass market. They have failed to create a product that directly is capable of being produced and distributed to a mass economy. The most recent counterexample to this, or counterargument, could be Tesla's new, cheaper model that is in the $35,000 price range. And I believe their 300,000 long individual wait list,
348,000.
exactly, is significant in revealing their inability to mass produce on a global scale. Some other things to consider that are essentially perks to this acquisition for us. Tesla is the most formidable rival in Uber's space right now due to their possession of a massive production capacity, as well as the fact that they could easily turn over a ride-sharing or ride-hailing app for autonomous vehicles in the same way that Uber does. This is a huge threat to our growth, and it makes a huge amount of sense to stop them in their tracks and rather assume control of their production capacities. The other benefit is credibility, because Tesla has been a frontier company in pushing for environmental business ethics. Another benefit not mentioned here is the elimination of surge pricing. Uber has come under fire over the past few years due to incentive pricing, where they increase the payment to their drivers in order to incentivize them to drive during rush hour times. So we can transfer these savings onto the user, who no longer has to pay for a human to drive them. So, within this internal restructuring, as Katie mentioned previously, one of the biggest ethical dilemmas that we're confronting here is taking away the share economy that we created. And the reality is that it isn't going away for longer than Uber has even existed. And Uber has existed for approximately 6 years, 5.5 years. And the full implementation of autonomous technology is not expected to surpass regular vehicles for at least 20 to 30 years. So I believe that by implementing a policy of transparency to our employees, it would be relatively easy to do this internal restructuring ethically by notifying them and giving them ample time to pursue other forms of employment. So, to conclude, between the three of us, we're making formal recommendations. Katie is recommending that we integrate autonomous technology within an ethical framework that obviously accounts for the environment, as well as our business objectives, as well as our users and employees. Taylor is recommending that we utilize litigation and activism to cultivate a legal environment that is compatible with autonomous technology. And I'm recommending that we merge, or rather structurally acquire, a reputable manufacturing partner so that we can spearhead the transition to autonomous technology by being our own production as well as our own distributor. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have some questions here. Now, Katie, the Uber drivers historically were not employees. They were historically independent contractors. That litigation against Uber and Lyft is still ongoing in the courts. Why would we have any responsibility to individuals who are theoretically, depending on the position you take as to the definition of an independent contractor, or certainly the one that Donald Trump or Ted Cruz might take if elected, why do we have responsibility to these individuals at all?
Okay, so yeah, great question, because Uber does regard their employees as private contractors, and that makes it easy for them, or for us, to perform some things that we wouldn't otherwise do. I want to reiterate again that though this is going to have this effect on our immediate drivers, it also has this mass effect on those associated with the auto industry as well. So in one respect, like, the environmental concerns that I'm bringing up are talking about sort of the mass employment that may result not just with our drivers, but
As
other
unemployment. But is it unemployment or is it displacement?
Okay.
And by displacement, what I mean is that markets and needs change, and perhaps instead of being involved in driving an Uber vehicle or servicing, that these new vehicles will require service personnel, because I mean they do have to be serviced. That insurance companies may not be selling the same type of product, but it will be a different product. So isn't that the same thing that went on during the Industrial Revolutions, that sectors change? Why is that ethically charged as opposed to ethically neutral, taking more than a very short-term view?
Well, I would answer that, first of all, that it's ethically charged due to the fact that Uber was one of the original proprietors of the share economy. Like Airbnb, Lyft, and the other apps followed Uber. Uber kind of came up with the concept of redistributing resources
Okay.
as a job.
But when somebody starts out and they say, I'm going to be I'm going to work on an assembly line at Ford, okay? And I'm going to go to college and I'm going to study auto mechanics. And now they get a job at Ford. And if that manufacturer is displaced out of the market, whatever they've trained for in their lives is now gone. Whereas in Uber, anybody with a driver's license, nobody studies to be an Uber driver. It's not like in London where the cabbies go through 2 years of training. This arose as a function of massive unemployment in the recession, that people became Uber drivers, but it's not a profession necessarily that they've trained for. So what's the big deal if we displace them?
I think you're identifying and you agree with our position on the limitations of our responsibility. Because something we outlined in our presentation is that we feel it's our responsibility to be as transparent as possible, but not much beyond that. We're not promising future employment 10 years from now for drivers, but something that we are doing to kind of cushion the potential job loss that we are identifying is partnering with an American company, Tesla, which is based in Fremont, which would potentially create thousands of new manufacturing jobs for Americans. So it is displacement, but it creates.
Now, I found it very interesting that you, because my husband's dying to buy a Tesla, I found it fascinating that you recommended partnering with Tesla. Musk is nobody's fool. And as much as it's a it's a public company, he owns a very, very nice chunk of this.
27%.
Why should he do this? Do you envision a hostile takeover? What are the corporate implications of this? And here's my corollary question. Why do we want to buy Tesla? Why don't we buy Detroit? What if we buy Ford, which is developing these things, but everybody is using the Tesla technology?
Right.
What if we buy another player in the market that's one of these historic car manufacturers where there's been tremendous displacement of their workers already? Can't we get them on the cheap and also appear to be doing good for Detroit?
Yes and no. So to answer the first part of your question, I definitely anticipated the egos involved in this. And looking at Travis Kalanick, who's the CEO of Uber, and Elon Musk, it doesn't seem likely that it could happen without a hostile takeover. But something that I mentioned is that we want to essentially take over 65% of the shares that are for sale to the public, meaning that it wouldn't be something that Musk could stop from happening. So we could do this. It would be essentially, I think, good for Tesla as a company as well, because their biggest problem right now is scale. They're unable to scale their business model because electric cars are so expensive to produce. They have to take long wait
But
lists.
it's coming.
Right, but to answer the second part of your question, we looked at a lot of American companies for acquisitions, and Ford is worth 4 times as much as Uber right now. And so Tesla is one of the few companies that fits this model of not only do they have a massive production capacity, they're not worth very much, even compared to Uber.
So now here's my other concern. If we engage in a legal negotiation with them where we purchase shares in them, and they become our exclusive provider of vehicles, do you see a monopolization, Sherman or Clayton, that potential problem here?
Well,
we're creating a vertical integration.
I'll quickly answer that, and then I'll turn it over if my teammates have anything to add. But just, I would point out the fact that the shared economy has given rise to a huge amount of competition. I mean, there are already ride-sharing apps that are eating up Uber's market. I mean, Lyft is going to triple in size this year, and most of that growth is coming from people having bad user experiences on Uber.
But if you go to this model and you make a deal with Tesla and you say to Tesla, now you need to be exclusive to us, you've got a legal problem there, don't you?
Well, I don't think that our position is that we want Tesla to become our exclusive provider. I think it's that we want to take over their capacity to produce cars. And Tesla could still continue their business model of producing cars and selling them to the public. Our goal is to reduce the cost of producing cars.
But the minute you create this service where the car drives itself, and in an urban area it's cheaper than owning the vehicle, basically you're taking most people in Manhattan and other parts of New York City, in every major urban area, and at that point you're gonna buy some sort of plan from Uber and, you know, dial them up somehow on your device, and it's going to appear at your door. I'm wondering how the person's going to pay for this without getting out of the car and not paying the fare, by the way. Let me ask Tyler a question, though, and that is that you said that, you know, there's not going to be any, you know, we won't have criminally negligent homicide. You're putting torts lawyers out of business, which may be a very good thing. But do you have any concerns that Uber could be held liable in criminal court as a legal person if one of these vehicles misfires or kills someone?
I think that although there's the potential for that, we can limit liability by having people sign waivers just like anything else.
Do waivers are enforceable in courts of law of this kind? Do you think that would ever be enforceable? Because the law, there's a great phrase in law, we always say that the law abhors a waiver. Especially if this becomes the means of transportation, you know, for the masses, that the law is suddenly not going to roll over and play dead and say, guess what, you waived all your rights here. I think that's very unlikely in the federal courts of this country or in the state courts.
Can you give me an example where we would potentially be?
You'd be liable for criminally negligent homicide. If something fails, the notion, there was a great slide up there, and I couldn't write it all down, but there was a notion that the criminal laws don't apply here, that we're dealing simply with negligence laws and we're reducing negligence. But if there's a manufacturing defect, think of the billions of dollars of potential liability in a class action of basically everybody using the service saying we could be part of a class similarly situated. That's terrifying. It could take you down completely and set back the use of these vehicles by 100 years.
I agree with that completely, and that's why I tried to position it as we would lobby through K Street to try to have it so we would fall under ordinary negligence law as opposed to falling under design defect law, right?
Do you think that Congress is going to play well with that? The notion that we've used our money and our influence to control the tort laws?
I mean, you definitely see in Congress that moneyed interest do have a huge amount of interest.
Oh, so now now we, as the shareholders, are going to go, oh, this is wonderful. We're going to now pay off Congress so that if something happens, if our engineers don't do the best, if we have, you're all too young to remember the Ford Pinto, right? Remember, Gail?
Exploding car.
Right?
It's 4.1 billion in class action.
That's correct. So we're going to do it better. We're going to lobby Congress and then pray that our engineers know what the hell they're doing in manufacturing this technology, right?
I would continue.
What are the consequences for us? I mean, you get a suit, and we're basically out of business. Our stakes are wiped out. You know, thank God for corporate, barriers to personal liability is all I can think.
I think that a part of the answer has to be when we go back to when I mentioned that an industry standard would inevitably have to be set, just as airbags and seatbelts were set, that we, along with any other auto manufacturers that made autonomous cars, would have to work with the government and establish whatever the criteria was for safe programming.
But we have airbag standards, and people are still suing the airbag manufacturers because the airbag was blowing up and people were dying from the airbags as much as they're designed to help.
It's true, but we can limit the culpability only to like a certain extent, right? We can't remove it completely.
I would also argue that autonomous cars are less likely to have an erroneous act that results in death than a human. I think you need to...
Well, they could have different types of erroneous acts, but you're saying they're not likely to have this 93% error rate.
3.5 million miles of testing isn't enough to know really how autonomous vehicles perform in every situation, but it is indicative that they drive better than people.
Yeah, there was something, I'm sorry, one more question. There was something on one of the early slides that talked about the infrastructure of our roads as not being potentially friendly to these vehicles. So isn't it the fact that all these people who potentially lose employment could be displaced into road construction, capital projects, et cetera?
Yeah.
In addition to that, I think another area for infrastructure that we spotted was how Tesla has popped up recharging stations throughout the West and East Coast, and even in some major cities elsewhere. Just to add to that.
Okay. How much more time do we have for questions?
11 minutes.
Okay. I just have a couple. I'm concerned about something that I'm sure you all can help me with. I understand the driverless car and the incredible impact on safety and the environment. But how do you deal with the human element here? Taxi drivers, for example, who have delivered babies, who have helped passengers who were heart attack victims or strokes, or who have seen things on the road where there was indeed a need for human intervention, and classically taxi drivers have had this man-woman on the street capacity to play a role. So you're dealing with an element that's missing. And I'm curious to know how you might respond to the loss of that from an ethical standpoint.
Well, this is something that we've confronted actually from a slightly different angle when we were looking at one of the most wide uses or case uses for Uber for ride-sharing apps is for drunk drivers who are avoiding an instance of having to drive and are instead seeking a free ride or not having to be behind the wheel. And I think that what you're describing is essentially that we need to construct a fail-safe to reinstate to people that it can take control of the vehicle. And fortunately, another dimension of why we want to partner with Tesla is that Tesla's autonomous vehicles, which are still conceptual designs at this point, would purportedly be able to be manually overridden and driven by a person, enabling them in an extreme situation like you're describing to take over the vehicle and go to a hospital or pull over or deliver a baby or call for help.
Taylor, you mentioned recalls quickly. It wasn't your main point. But I'm wondering if there are any ethical implications of recalls that you all have had a chance to think through.
Well, one, obviously, because what occurred, there was some design flaw or programming flaw that put people in harm's way. But one benefit of the autonomous cars is a lot of the programming issues could be fixed without a recall because they could be done wirelessly.
Okay. Last question. And this probably is more toward Katie. In terms of the context of what you described, and Tyler's comment that the purpose of business at Uber is profit and growth, where is the ethical kind of code of conduct that Uber is going to draw on as you make this transition? It'd be great to hear a little bit about that before Michael takes over.
Could you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure, sorry, it probably wasn't a great clear question. I'm curious about the ethical framework that Uber's changes are going to go in, because what I heard was profit and growth. Totally understandable. But I don't know, as you make these other changes as a disruptor, what are some ethical principles that Uber will be using besides care of the environment and besides more safety? Is there anything that I missed that I need to see?
Well, just within like the transitional stage at least, we propose that we want to be completely transparent with the public about the implications of the cars, and especially if we are displacing workers in this, or displacing our contractors in this way. We want people to have an understanding of what the impacts are going to be, but we also want people to have an understanding of what is motivating our decision to do this. And something that was, I just want to respond again to what you were saying about the sort of ethical, how is this as ethical as we maybe think that it is? Something that we had in mind is that people have an understanding that there is a public distrust for Uber's policies in a lot of ways. So a couple of different things that Uber has done in the past. So I think it's really easy to frame this move as something that's just going to be very profitable for us. And so we wanted to prove to you, our shareholders, that though it will be profitable for us, there is a very significant ethical motivation behind it, that we want to try and mitigate as much harm in the future as we can.
Is that our motivation or is that a consequence? To justify this wonderful financial thing, which I'm really finding so incredibly fascinating.
Well, I think Katie kind of briefly mentioned it, but the string of controversies that Uber has been involved in the past speak to a need to reboot a corporate ethic. I mean, if you look at Google, when Google recently relaunched and named themselves Alphabet, and when they did this, they changed their corporate ethic structure from don't be evil to do the right thing. So Uber, similarly, needs to have a public, not necessarily mission statement, but ethics statement or commitment to some position on ethics. And the way that we frame this is looking at how Uber affects the environment and how Uber affects individuals and employees. So I would say that that's our framework. And sorry.
Actually, kind of piggyback on the Gail's question. So the most controversial part of autonomous cars, in my mind, is the AI. What is the AI going to do when a child walks out in front of the car as opposed to an 85-year-old person, let's say? And that's just one example, right? The environmental aspect makes sense financially. I think it's plausible, but inevitably, I feel like we need to take a stance on how that AI works. What are the ethical, what is the ethical framework for the AI that we would support? Because while it's still in development and you spoke to standards, I feel like that's something that we need to get ahead of in terms of what we would be for, or to make decisions to support that. And I think transparency, you guys mentioned that several times, I think that's absolutely critical. The only part missing to the transparency part is what about the rider base and how they feel about using a service that's now going to be powered by an autonomous car versus a human driver. Does that make sense?
Yes. Quickly, I would just say that I think it's probably easier to alert riders and probably with less consequences than drivers, because jobs versus just having an option to order an autonomous car on the app is a little bit simpler than alerting people that they lost their job. But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to.
Can you expand on the question?
It's really around the AI, because the whole concept is there's no standard, right? So but it has to be programmed by a human. So that's hotly debated in terms of what should the autonomous car do in all those situations. We have to program it to do that. So more or less, what is that framework for either influencing that or saying, our cars will take this stance. And that's, obviously that's a big unknown, but I think that ethically, how do we manage that as a company?
Okay, I understand. As I said before, I think we should try to work with the industry as a whole as well as the state to decide what program we program the AI with. Personally, I think that maybe some form of utilitarian calculus, which places the driver's needs a little bit lower than perhaps a pedestrian's needs, because they've assumed some of the risks simply by entering the vehicle, and having that knowledge as opposed to someone walking across the street maybe doesn't assume the same level of risk.
I think it's also critical to point out the development period that we're in right now. The testing that's underway is improving the technology already. So I think over time we'll be able to construct a more accurate representation of how the technology behaves, and then we can construct a specific ethic regarding who is the end that we're trying to protect. So.
I also want to add quickly that because 93%, as I mentioned in the presentation, of accidents are because of human error, that although determining the exact calculus we use is important, just having a calculus will result in less deaths. because we're able to use this technology.
Okay, all right, then we can move on to the feedback. As an employment lawyer, and I've tried cases involving Uber, I have to tell you. I honestly thought that because the area is so, it's so up in the air right now as to whether these are even employees and what our obligations are to them as employees or as independent contractors. I honestly thought that was a tremendous distraction for me to the core issue of why are we proposing this technology? How is it beneficial to the public? In other words, I think that if you look at who is the stakeholder, and when you just said utilitarian calculus, you're putting the passenger perhaps, or maybe the pedestrian, on a higher level in the hierarchy than a driver, or a driver is an individual, driver is an employee. What are the benefits for society as a whole? I think if you would frame that way, and then gone into the financial element of, this linkage with Tesla, to me it would have been a cleaner case. I think it's very easy to get lost in the mud of what employment law is right now and the consequences. The whole Uber Lyft employment thing is a lot of politics and a lot of trying to fit a new technology and a new form of doing business into laws that are 100 years old. And that's where you see the tremendous tension of what is doing right, what is doing good, and whether the law is equipped to even handle this under the structure that we have now. So I personally would have rather seen you go into the legal end of it and stay out of employment, but go more into this issue that you went into in terms of torts law, allocation of risk. Is this less riskier to the public? This is very hard. I mean, I live in this world every day of my life. This is very, very hard stuff. And I'm going to tell you, go read Calabrese on the cost of accidents, because I'm going to go home and reread it tomorrow night, relevant to this particular industry. The financial, to me, was it was aspirational, it was a real reach, but this stuff cold. It really shows that this is your comfort level, even doing something that wasn't clear cut, you were very comfortable pitching this. I mean, I felt most secure in your argument, I will say, because you convinced me financially. More, I think, than the ethical or the legal. And that may be because it's very hard to pitch law to somebody who's been at the rodeo for basically 40 years of my life. But I thought this is a hard case. You picked a hard case.
We always do.
You always do, okay? Sometimes hard cases don't win. But they're phenomenal cases because they make you think. And I think you picked a case to challenge yourselves to start with, and hopefully challenge everybody who's listening to you as well. And that's a very commendable thing to do, to push the envelope a little bit. Real hard one.
I think you all deserve a lot of credit. I think it is a complex case. I think the good news is going into the 10-minute, you really need to focus on the ethics piece of it. You've got some great information in legal and in finance, but I think you really need to figure out an approach that really streamlines. You have a clear utilitarian approach, which may not sit well if you were in the real world with all the outcomes without thinking through some of the ways of mitigating how common good is. But think about it as you do your 10 minutes. Use the best of your material and use it in service of, as Ruth suggests, narrowing your focus, so that however you choose to narrow it, so that there is ethical powerhouse. Because what came through in this one, even though ethics was woven in, for me, the financial issue was clearer. The legal was more confusing to me in terms of implications, because it's not my area. And you were talking to shareholders, and you had some good facts. You covered a lot of ground, Katie, so think about, as you come together and how you're going to do this, how you can speak to the best and most powerful arguments of what you have. And that's the beauty of 10 minutes, because you have a lot of richness. You can just cull it a little more. Don't recycle the same, in my view, don't recycle the same presentation and reduce it down to 10. Because you've got real nuggets here, and you can reframe them and realign them in ways that can be very powerful.
Be stronger again, absolutely. Michael?
Yeah, I agree that I think it was incredibly difficult, and the reason I think it was is that you really have like at least a few ethical dilemmas. So I think to Gail's point, figuring out if there's one that's the strongest, or somehow combining those, that's critical, because it was difficult for me to follow the financial reasoning without clearly understanding what the real problem was. The financial aspect, it sounded great, and it seemed like a great idea, but I didn't connect how it solved the actual for me. But there's clearly an issue. I think it just needs to be, like Gail said, distilled and figure out how those all work together.
I mean, if the goal is that this reduces accidents massively, and the financial pitch that you are making will lead to the stability and growth of an industry, which then will save lives, that's a very easy connection to make. The technology is there. This Uber's affiliation boosts it up, makes it accessible to more people, saves lives, reduces congestion on the roads, makes commuting faster, leaves more time for people to live their lives instead of having road rage. That also saves lives, I guess. Then it all kind of ties together in a very clean way. And to the extent that there's loss of employment, well, those people can all be recycled into alternative forms of employment, because now you've got to build infrastructure all over the country. If there's anything that's going to improve the economy of the United States and what saved us in the Great Depression, it was building infrastructure.
You might think about the fact that you all are disruptors, and you could argue that this is what 21st century America needs.
It's all about
more disruption in order that we can accomplish greater good, or can accomplish whatever. And I think it's completely safe to be clear about the fact that you are disrupting with the idea of creating a better society.
because that was what Uber was all. Uber was a disruptive force ab initio from its beginning. It's pitched as a negative in terms of, the evil company displacing taxi drivers and also not owning up to employment. But if you perceive it as a social and cultural disruptor, that's for X, leading to common good, you've got a totally different animal on your hands.
With all the same information.
With all the same information, you already have all the information.
It does.
You have homework for tonight.
The environmental aspect, I think, is great, and people really like that.
And
but
you've got great
real-
facts to support that.
Realistically, though, Tesla was successful because they figured out that people care about more than just that.
Right.
And they make sexy cars.
Yeah.
And that's why people, I think, a combination of those
The perfect
things.
storm, the
Just the
perfect storm.
environmental aspect or benefit is not the only. It's important,
Right.
obviously.
But I really admire the fact that when you guys took this on, you took on something that society still hasn't figured out yet.
That's right.
So and we're excited enough, I think, about what you did, that our desire is to see you use the wonderful research in a way that will simplify it for you, because you can control it, as Ruth suggested, by how you frame it, however you do.
This is
good
one
job.
of the few times I've ever seen a presentation where you could take the same subject matter, you could represent it in the way that Gail is suggesting next year, and do the same case twice. I don't know if Tom allows that in the rules, but
You're all
literally-
graduating, so it doesn't matter to you.
Well, they could,
That's right, it could be your
it
MBA.
could be their MBA
No, but
presentation, but it could be, you could take this thing and redo the whole thing and have it be a different case, literally.
I think we spent so much time just to clarify, not because of failure in the presentation, but in an awareness of where you're going with this in an ethics competition.
Right.
And wanting to make
Structure.
sure that you have the best from us to go into the next level.
Yeah, I think that, just to briefly comment to respond, I think that what we were struggling with the most was reining in a case that was this large into 30 minutes. And then I think where we might have lost sight was that instead of tackling one specific issue and providing a trajectory to how to solve it, we instead addressed a swath of issues and
Because there are
tried to create a
issues.
palette response that can be diluted, obviously, because it's spread out.
And you don't have case law, as
No.
you mentioned. I mean, you don't have anything to go on here.
Well, we do
Except
have-
your own.
Do you know where we do have case law though? We have case law in terms of the manufacturing processes and automation and the consequences of that for workplace accidents. So there's a huge body of case law on this. OSHA, there's a bunch of case law, but and that happens to resound heavily in employment. But you would have had to be a law student to know how to reach out of your little zone
And we don't expect
into
that.
that case law. We can't expect that of you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have to go.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.